We're here in the kitchen of Mary Somerville, and Mary is the person who studied the history of the creek names and their history and so forth of the Johnson County watershed. And I think, well, we're just going to talk about those. Also, where Mary is sitting, she is sitting in front of a quilt of the watershed that she made. And we'll take a picture of that too, so
Great.
we can see it close up. And we'll also show this. Maybe we can hold this up. I don't know how good it is, but
Yeah, I will focus on okay.
good. Because, Mary, this is what inspired Rosemary and myself to do this program.
I'm just giving it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a history, and now let's talk about the history of the creek names. I wonder, maybe you should hold this.
Okay.
And it's up to you.
Okay. Well, I'll just begin, I guess, on how this project got started. Every year, the Johnson County Soil and Water Conservation District has a fair booth, and as we look forward to Tuesdays, which is Children's Day, we know we have to have interesting things to draw the children in because we also want their parents to notice some of our work. So we were trying to think of things the kids could do, and so we had the theme of the booth that year was planting buffer strips along the creeks and waterways to keep the soil from getting into the creek and all the things that water can take with it as it spills in. And we had a lot of vegetation on display, but we got the idea of doing a quiz on the creeks and how they got their names. So I started looking at a Johnson County map and started noting the names. Well, some of them were named after animals, and that was easy to figure out a clue for the kids to figure out what creek that might be. But then there were some other creeks with names that were obviously names of people. Ralston, Snyder, Schaefer, Miller, Swisher, and so on and so on. And of course, I didn't have a clue on how those creeks got their names, so that's really kind of what started the whole project. Luckily, because we live in Johnson County and have access to great libraries and the State Historical Society, I was really able to find a lot of references and begin tracking down where some of these names came from. So I basically just kind of started a spreadsheet by township and the creeks that were flowing through those townships. Sometimes when you looked at the township itself, then you could link that up with some early settlers who were in that area. And then in further reading, I did find out that the first sheriff that was in Johnson County, Sheriff Trowbridge, we recognized that name from the name of a hall. I didn't know it was named after a sheriff. But he was really the one who early on was going out into the county. I'm guessing he was probably out settling some land disputes or maybe collecting taxes or going about whatever a sheriff was busy doing back in the 1840s. And so he really began naming the creeks because they were important landmarks for him also in terms of finding his way to various places. So that he was kind of a person who probably actually named those creeks, would come back, and those would get entered into the maps and the plats of that era. When this project became more public, some people would say, Mary, how did you come up with all those creek names? And some people still are under the impression that I personally have been going out naming creeks, and that's not true. I just dug through history and found out what their names were. So it was all had a lot of historical interest. But, you know, as soil and water commissioners, we're mostly interested in the way we're taking care of our natural resources. So a lot of this research, I believe, was probably in the year 2000 when we were involved in an election. And you start noticing how politicians, when they get up and give their big speeches at the conventions, They will talk about issues, and it could be about jobs, or it could be about how the military is doing their job. And often the speaker will say, for instance, and they'll name a person that's there in the audience. They give the issue a name, and I think that causes people to personalize it more and to care about it more. So we were thinking that worked with the creeks too. We lead busy lives, and we're driving around this county with some destination in mind. If you look at our bridges, they're no longer those nice old iron bridges that have sides that you can actually see through. Now we have those concrete.
I know.
And so, we don't even see the creeks anymore. And sometimes in developing areas, they're actually disappearing. They put in big culverts and fill them in, and the creek is gone. So that was really the idea about putting signs really came along with that. If we call attention to the names of the creeks, their history, and their importance in terms of how they're just a part of our landscape, just like big trees, just like famous landmarks around Johnson County. We have plenty of those, that the creeks are very important too as far as our future and the health of our children in the future too. Mm-hmm. So that's where we kind of came up with the idea. As commissioners, I'm not sure exactly who thought of it, but what about signs? And so that's when we just started the project of, okay, what all goes into signing a creek? So I did some work on that. My initial work was to take all those creeks and on the map figure out how many crossings we had, how many roads crossing those creeks. And I think I came up at that time that we would need, there are 328 crossings, places where roads go over creeks in Johnson County. And if you had a sign on each side that you're getting up to for around 650 signs, well, that would be a pretty expensive project. So we found out that we needed to go to the Board of Supervisors because we wanted to start with the blacktop roads. The DOT, the Iowa DOT, said they do not allow signs except on like major rivers. And we see that. You see the Iowa River sign when you cross that. But unlike other states, our Department of Transportation doesn't really sign creeks along the state highways. So we did go to the Board of Supervisors with the idea of just piloting this project. Let's see what happens if we just designate a few crossings scattered around the county and then wait and see what the public reaction would be. And the public reaction was very positive. People were very fascinated with it. So based on that original, maybe we put out we signed about 10 crossings scattered around, and then phase 2 was, our goal was to place signs at every place that a hard surface road in the county crossed over a creek. So we purchased the signs through the Soil and Water Conservation District. We raise money every year for educational purposes. We sell trees and plants and those kind of things. So we used that revenue to purchase the signs, and we had a wonderful relationship with the Secondary Roads Department in Johnson County. Gary Tegas is the sign guy for the county, and he has a crew that comes on extra help every summer when they go around, do a lot of sign maintenance. So he said we could just load our signs up, and as they were around doing routine maintenance in the county on other matters, they would put the signs up as they went. So through that summer, then more and more signs went up. And again, I think we've just gotten a lot of real positive reactions. From that came the map. We actually have won some awards for this effort. The Johnson County Heritage Society awarded us some recognition at one of their meetings. And we also won the Irving Weber Award. And, he's a great history guy. So that was a great honor for us to have Irving Weber's name attached with the sign project, too. So it's been a real group effort, and we are beginning more and more to have contacts from other counties in Iowa. And they are interested in how we went about this, because they're recognizing that it's an important effort for people to have respect for those waterways.
Yes, yes.
You know, Barbara, I was really excited when you called me for this interview when you said you were from the Senior Center, because I have a hunch that there's a lot of creeks in Johnson County that we still don't know the name of. And the reason is, when we first put the map out at the fair, during Fair Week, I had a call from a woman, and she said, you know, you don't have my creek on your map. And I said, oh, well, what's the name of your creek? And she said, well, it's Conklin Creek. We've always called it Conklin Creek. And so I realized that our map just shows the main flow of the creek, but off of that are all kinds of little creeks that feed into it, obviously. And I think that, you know, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, when agriculture and all those family farms were much more dominant in Johnson County, that nearly every child growing up out in the rural areas would have had their creek. And it may not be one of these main creeks, but they had their creek, and they may have called it by their family name, or they may have dubbed it, or their grandfathers did, I don't know. But we think there's still a lot of names out there. So it's possible with this program that you're doing that we might start to add in a lot more names for the creeks that flow through Johnson County. I'm not sure we can fit them all on a map, but I think it just brings home the fact again that creeks and water is just such an important part of our life. And we recognize, with all the development going on in the county and the changing landscape, that we are losing those creeks as far as really having access to them. Of course, it's more, you know, the private land, it's getting more and more subdivided, and so our people don't really have as much access to them as freely. But we'd like to think that generations in the future, there will be children who still will be able to get down to a grassy banked creek and look for crawdaddies and see the minnows and get their feet wet. And we just think that that's a big piece of the quality of that has gone into our lives as children, and for our children. And so I'm hoping that people that watch this program, if they're Johnson County residents and they notice that we don't have their creek, that we'd really like to hear from them, and we can just get more names and more history on our map.
Well, that would be interesting. It could almost be a project at the Senior Center about your creek.
Mm-hmm.
And that reminds me of my creek where I played when I was young. Of course, that was in Wisconsin. I don't remember the name of it. It was just down by Uncle Rudy's. But it was a wonderful creek.
Oh, yeah. That's the thing we found about a lot of these is some reference happened. There's a number of creeks that actually, over time, their name changed. I can't remember. I was thinking it was Snyder Creek, was known by some other name, but I think it's possible that either as the land changed hands from one owner to another, or maybe if some person fell in disfavor, whatever, that they would, during some time period, maybe shift those names. But, you know, we have some famous people that lived in Johnson County, and they really didn't get a creek named after them. We have Gilbert Street and some of those kinds of things.
Right.
So, but I think a lot of these was because of the particular landowner that was near that area.
Right. Yeah.
I have the Lingle Creek, the family that's currently living in Johnson County by the name of Lingle. They were a little critical because they said we had the name spelled wrong. And of course, we went through the history, and it ends with L-E, and it's probably not too uncommon for those letters to get reversed in different names. So the family now spells their name with E-L on the end, and they really felt we should change this. And I said, well, we really aren't in the business of changing creek names or spellings, so we just got to go by the history of it. Some of these, of course, had those Native American legends too. I found those really very interesting. Old Man's Creek and Old Woman's Creek. That was, I thought, very interesting because it took us back to the pre-settlement history. The part out by the fairgrounds, there's the lookout, Indian Lookout it was called. There was really a lot of controversy at the time when the Interstate 218 went through there. A lot of people tried to stop that construction project because it was really going right through Indian Lookout.
Oh.
And there's a rich history there. But it is a very high area that from Indian Lookout you could see, if you could imagine looking up towards Iowa City from the fairgrounds without all the buildings and everything there, it would be a good place that you could see all the way up the Iowa River. And the legend on Old Man's Creek says that it was a lookout place, and if some of the unfriendly tribes were coming down the Iowa River, kind of on the attack for whatever reason, then they would send the women and the children, the old men and the old women and the children up the creekway for safety. Because there were a lot of encampments of the Native Americans in the area, around Sand Road and Napoleon Park, that's just kind of just south of the bus barn where the Iowa City buses are. So they would just send them on up the creek, and Old Man's Creek goes further, and Old Woman's sort of branches off. It flows into Old Man's Creek, but it does branch off to the north. So if you try to picture that, you can just imagine the tribal members kind of scurrying off up the creekways, and they would probably send the women and children on up that first big creek area to hide, while the rest of the men might keep going straight west as sort of another way, kind of like a decoy.
The Creeks of Johnson County is a program about the Johnson County watershed. A watershed is the land that water flows across or under on its way to a stream, river, or lake. You will see the water in the Johnson County creeks being tested in a number of different ways. This challenge is endless as the landscape continues to change. You will see clear streams, while others are less visible as they all but disappear beneath the heavy growth of grasses. Then there are some which have been used as a dumping area.
All right, well, we're here in the Snyder Creek watershed near the mouth of Snyder Creek where it goes into the Iowa River. Of course, it still has a little bit ways to go before it gets there, but we've chosen this site mainly for the easy access, and this is one of our 6 test sites on Snyder Creek, and we have 6 because we've chosen to kind of take a watershed approach to water monitoring, and the Snyder Creek was a focus of attention because of issues of flooding, some runoff issues as Iowa City begins to grow into the Snyder Creek watershed area, and we're just trying to pick up some of the differences between the agriculture inputs and the urban inputs and track those over time. So right now we're kind of still in a state of collecting baseline information. We're not really making a whole lot of conclusions yet, although this will be year 4, so we're beginning to see some changes or some trends. And what we do here is we take chemical tests, which involve like nitrates and phosphates and the pH and the temperature of the water. We track those on nearly a monthly basis. Now we also take biological tests, and usually we do those about 3 times per year. And that's a good indicator is the biology, because if we can see certain types of bugs, macroinvertebrates, we can kind of gauge the different ones' tolerances to pollution. So if we're seeing a certain type of species rather than another, we know maybe there's some things going on in the water that's allowing these species to live rather than another. So we do the biology. We also do, and this is an easy one for anybody to do, is just the physical aspects, and that's taking pictures, taking video, and actually seeing the bank's conditions over time. We like to track the amount of water that's moving per second through the water. I was talking about the chemical, physical, and biological testing we do, and those are all part of a program that the Iowa Department of Natural Resources sponsored. It's called the Iowa Water Program, and it's a volunteer-led program. It's held training throughout the state in the last few years, and that allows volunteers to get the training they need to get out and literally be testing in their backyard within 2 to 3 days after they take the course. They're supplied all the equipment they need, and we're using much of that equipment here today.
Do you want some water for those sample jars, or you're going to take them here?
This is one of the tests that we do. It's called the dissolved oxygen test, and it's pretty important for the aquatic wildlife and the plants and animals, of course. And this one is a test for dissolved oxygen that's based on a color variation. And so we're taking our sample and basing it up against this color comparator, and it gives us a relative number in parts per million or milligrams per liter. And for this, we're getting, it might be kind of hard to see in the light here, but it's probably anywhere in between 8 and 10. And that's usually what we see here. And on average, that's probably what we see in the watershed on a continuing basis. This is when I was talking about doing some of the verification with the professional equipment. So this is one way we're going to be doing it today, is taking their tests to the hygienic lab, and they'll be doing some analysis on the nitrates, nitrogen in the water, and we'll be comparing it to this test here, the Hawk test strips that the Iowa Water Program supplies, just to see how close we are to the actual number. And we like to do that. Hopefully we can do that once a year, just to kind of see how we're doing with our testing and making sure it's right on, and making any changes if we need to.
Here we are at the Snyder Creek watershed, and James Martin is going to tell us all about it because I don't know anything. But that's all right. That's what we're here for, to learn. James?
Okay. Yes, we are in the Snyder Creek watershed, and this is part of the urban side of the watershed. The watershed's about 17,000 acres, and it goes from here on down to the Iowa River. And so we're here in Iowa City, about the intersection of Highway 6 and Scott Boulevard. And this is an area that we test for. This is one of the 6 test sites that we have in the Snyder Creek watershed. And this being site number 4 here today. And this is our urban site. This is pretty much the only urban site we have. So this area has changed a whole lot just since we've kind of been here. What we're standing on is basically land now, but it was deposited here. This stream, when we first started testing, there would have been water flowing right underneath our feet. So there's been a lot of silt and deposits coming in here from the upper part of the watershed. And so we'll kind of keep monitoring this as time goes by to see if the creek starts to narrow itself, and as it narrows itself, it's going to be moving quicker, and as it's moving quicker, it's going to want to take out some of these meanders and try to straighten itself out. But that may not be good for the habitat But the more water we get into the creek, stormwater from the urban runoff above, the more we're going to see that happen. The newest neighbor to the creek in this area is, of course, the grocery store. That wasn't here last year, so things are changing here.
Now you want to get to work, and we
Yeah.
want to take some pictures of you
All right.
working.
We'll get started then.
Okay, thanks, James.
I'm doing a lot of side-by-side comparisons this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a lab lend me that so I can get a little bit better indication. There's a lot of rocks in here, and they purposely put these rocks in here. They weren't here when they built this area. This was meant to be kind of a rock riffle, and the riffle would add habitat for any like small fish, not large fish because there wouldn't be any large fish in here, but other aquatic wildlife. We have a 1.7.
Okay.
And at our third, it's right at 0.1.
And so how many times you have to do that every month?
Our goal is to do all this procedures that I'm doing here once a month at each site.
We all live in a watershed. Everything we do affects the soil, water, air, plants, and animals. I am reminded of the words of Chief Seattle, who said, "Man did not weave the web of life, he is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself."
A lot of the attention that we're giving to the creeks has led us to forming what we're calling watershed groups. We have 2 watershed groups right now in Johnson County that are very active, and I'll tell you about a couple of them. One is, everybody knows about Lake McBride, but do you know the names of the 2 creeks that feed into Lake McBride? Well, it's Mill and Jordan. And those are the 2 creeks. Mill flows into the northern part of Lake McBride, and then Jordan flows into the southern part of it. And we at the Johnson County Soil and Water Conservation District have received funding through the Environmental Protection Agency, through their water protection funds that become available. They flow through the states. And they're called 319 projects. I think 319 is just a number for the legislation that came out of the Clean Water Act. And so over the years, the Soil and Water Conservation District, along with other partners, have applied for those funds. And right now, we have a really wonderful project going on in Lake McBride. Now, a watershed, if you step back away and think about, everybody knows about the Continental Divide in the United States, that all the water that flows on this side of the Continental Divide will eventually end up in the Pacific Ocean, and all the water that falls on this side will eventually end up in the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic Ocean. Well, now we think on a really small scale. And a watershed is really that area where all the water that falls, if you think of the hills around Johnson County, they just form natural watersheds. And that means that the water that falls in some areas will flow into Clear Creek. And then once you go up over a big hill, you're then in the Old Man Creek's watershed. And that means that all the activity that goes on those acres and acres of land, like I'm thinking the Clear Creek watershed, there's 13,000 acres of land that the water flowing off of that will eventually come into the Iowa River out of Clear Creek, right down there by the Iowa River Power Company. So all that surface water is flowing into what we call the Clear Creek watershed. The Clear Creek water, well, let me go back, I guess I jumped ahead. The Lake McBride project, we know that a lot of money has gone into restoring the lake. They've gone in, they've dredged, they've improved the shoreline so that the soil isn't washing away from the edge of the shoreline. All of those are important activities that will help with the habitat for the wildlife, for the fish, but also keep the quality of water in Lake McBride safe for recreational uses. We just hate it when we hear about beaches closing down in Iowa, where kids can't even go to a public beach and swim because of the quality of the water. Well, where does that water come from that goes into Lake McBride? It's coming out of the watersheds of Mill Creek and Jordan Creek. So we have a project, and it's headed by Amy Bauska, who's on our staff. And she's working with various people that live in those two creek watersheds that feed into Lake McBride. She's working with the town of Solon, the Solon schools, with landowners, the golf course. She's working with the sailing club, the McBride or the University Sailing Club. Anybody that has an interest or an impact in that area, representatives of them are coming together, and their main purpose is looking at how can we maintain the health of this lake. The landowners, if they're agricultural people, then they are looking at ways that they can plant buffers along their part of the creek or the little bits of small creeks that run into the bigger creeks. And that way there will be filter strips that will keep harmful soil particles, the harmful things attached to soil particles, like any kind of nutrients that are on the land, will filter them out before they actually flow into the creek. They're also doing some work with some of the housing developments that are popping up in that area. There are homeowners associations in those different developments, and they come together regularly, and they're looking at ways that they can also do strategic plantings so that, again, the water gets filtered. Many of them are really starting to look at their practices of mowing these huge yards. I mean, it's nice to live in the country and enjoy country living, but you know, you get a little tired of enjoying it from the seat of a John Deere lawn and garden tractor, where if they have less lawn and then can plant native grasses and wildflowers that really require less maintenance, they're finding that they enjoy it more, they have more time to enjoy it, and we also know that, again, it's eliminating the rain running off of that sod grass because the roots don't go down very far. It gets saturated. It's going to take along any kind of lawn fertilizer that you've put on there. It'll wash right down into the creek too. Native grasses, they have longer roots. And so as they go down, 5 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet, some of those grasses have very deep roots, then the rainwater will tend to go down into the soil instead of always running off. It's sort of creating a little bit of our historical landscape. We were a prairie, weren't we?
Yes, we were.
Yes, we were. And we had healthy creeks back then, clear creeks, we think. And so by putting buffer strips and minimizing the amount of runoff off of plowed land, off of just turf grass, that water can then go down into the soil and actually recharge the aquifer. Because that's another concern we have. People will say, well, I don't drink out of the creek, do I? Why should I care? Well, we care about our drinking water and our wells, and we can recharge that groundwater by slowing the water down, keeping it from running off, letting it seep in, and as it filters down through the soil, then we have restored that cycle of having groundwater that is replenished. Because if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. So while a lot of our attention has been to the creeks as far as groundwater, we're equally concerned that we are recharging that precious groundwater. So that Lake McBride project is one. I think we'll see a lot of visibility up there. They're having wonderful meetings. They're teaching people about how to apply herbicides wisely, both on farmland and our residential lawns. They're just doing lots of projects, I think, that will, in the long term, keep that lake healthy and also avoid the fact that maybe 50 years from now, some other generation is going to have to go back in, dredge the lake out, and repair the damage that's done. We want to protect that public investment. We have a group called the Clear Creek Watershed Enhancement Project, and their mission is to make Clear Creek clear again. And that's made up of a real variety of people. Clear Creek stretches on west through Johnson County and on into Iowa County, and so we have a group of partners that have been meeting together for 4 years, believe it or not, but we're not discouraged and we don't give up. But we have representatives from the University of Iowa, from the grounds and campus planner, because Clear Creek does go by some university property. We have representatives from the city of Coralville, from the Soil and Water Conservation District. We have some partners on our board that represent some of the businesses along the Coralville Strip. And then we have some farmers who farm out around the Tiffin and Oxford areas. And we are really working again on some public awareness and education. We have started another sign project. We like signs, I guess. I hope we aren't cluttering up the landscape too much, but the purpose of the Clear Creek signs are to call attention to the positive things that citizens in the Clear Creek watershed are doing to make Clear Creek clear. And we presented our first sign just a few weeks ago to the city of Coralville. They have had a grand opening of a new shelter in one of their parks, Northridge Park, and the shelter has a green roof on it. The roof, rather than having shingles or tile, it has plants. And the plants that are growing there are specially, they have native grasses and native flowers that are planted. And the idea of that, of course, is to minimize the amount of water that is shed off of the roof. They've done a lot of other things that have been we call it green, the color green development, in using a lot of recycled building materials there, making the best use of solar energy and natural kind of wind or natural air circulation to minimize the need for air conditioning. It's really a place that people really ought to visit, but it'd make a wonderful place to check out. But we did present them with a sign to recognize green development as something that we really have to start paying attention to. We got the ideas from a field trip to Germany. The people in Germany, in towns and different places, cats competing for the airspace.
Well, we should get
Some people in developing areas,
Kitty.
people in developing areas in Germany, they tax their citizens for the amount of water that runs off of their property. And so because of that, they are very careful about what they let run off their property. So they have in their yards, instead of so much grass and kind of quick ways, gutters to get the water off as quickly as possible. They have beautiful rain gardens and pools and ponds and things like that. But they also use these green roofs as a way to soak up the rainfall. And some of them, some of them even garden. I think of a fairy tale when I was a kid of the cow up grazing on the roof. That seemed very strange to me, but actually it's coming back. So that's a recognition to the city of Coralville for their real forward thinking and looking at something like that. Some places would just kind of laugh and say, planting plants on the roof, that'll never work. Well, I guess you can stop out in Coralville and see what's going on. But we'll have a few more signs calling attention again to things that farmers, landowners are doing to really slow that creek down, not let it carry things away that don't need to be in the water. So we just have to constantly educate, and I think once people know, we're all concerned about the environment, and we read about it, and we worry about it, but sometimes we throw up our hands and say, but what can I do? Well, the watershed, looking at things through a watershed view gives you lots of ideas of things to do, because it's your property where you're making decisions, it's your neighbors around you. And as you start doing those kinds of things, then it gives you that stronger sense of community, and that you are making a difference in the area where you live. And that's a good place to start.
That's a good place to start, and if we all did it, wouldn't, well.
It would get done,
It would
wouldn't
get
it,
done, and
Barbara?
it would just start all kinds of other things. One thing I wanted to mention or ask are programs in schools focusing on this and on the ecology, and especially on this water also. You mentioned different projects. Are there children involved?
Yes, there are children involved. Actually, for a long time, I've been aware in Iowa City, maybe it started at Roosevelt. They kind of have a ravine near Roosevelt Elementary School. And they became interested in this, and so they have done a lot of plantings in that ravine, and that would be a place that has been protected by the school children through their projects.
Good.
And of course, they're able to enhance it with, birdhouses and habitat, but then it becomes a classroom, and they can go out and watch
Outdoor
what's happening.
classroom. We need more of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Coralville Central has a kind of an outdoor classroom around their school. There's many, I can't name them all, but I know there's several Iowa City elementaries that have what we call prairie pockets, and where the kids have gone out and seeded a prairie, and they even get all the kids out there to stomp on it like buffalo, which they loved, to get it started. And I'll bet a lot of those prairies are getting very mature by now, because they've been out there for several years. And the curriculum in Iowa City schools and actually other schools around our area, of course, children are always very interested in their worlds and have a lot of passion for taking care of critters and their
Yes,
environment.
yes.
So it isn't hard to get them mobilized to do some things. And their teachers, I think, do a lot to encourage that. We just hope that people take that back home with them and start doing some of that same thing in their own backyard. So I think a lot of things are going on educationally that will, like you say, keep that idea in kids' minds that there are things they can do and they should never stop doing them.
That's right. Could they contact you? If someone had something, would they contact you, or would the water
I think probably the best way might be
soil
to,
conservation?
on the map itself, there
Yeah.
are copies of the map available at the Soil and Water Conservation District office. We've now moved to 51 Escort Lane, which is, it's off of Highway 1, kind of out where the Miller's Monument and Gina's BMW. Here's a few plugs for some businesses that are around us, but we have them available there. We will have them at the Johnson County Fair. They'll be out there. And there is a phone number there that they could call, and or they could send email to our site.
Okay.
We'd love to keep getting information
Yeah,
from people.
Thank you so much for all this marvelous information. Really enjoyed it. We all live in a watershed. Everything we do affects the soil, water, air, plants, and animals. I'm reminded of the words of Chief Seattle, who said, "Man did not weave the web of life, he is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself."
date's always up.
Yes.
So how you donated?
Skip every couple. I don't get all of the No, you don't want that out. Are you?
Nah, good. Amy's good.
Learn how to do the tests, and that's going to spend some time with you because you guys are going to do the test in the field. The only other thing that I got to say is you will be working in the water and off of bridges. We're collecting a lot of data today. None of that data is worth getting hurt for. If you get in a position that it's unsafe to be in the water, forget about it. If it's unsafe to get off the bridge, forget about the data. I don't want anybody hurt today. Okay? And that's going to teach you how to take the tests. And then after she does that, then we'll kind of break out into teams and decide where everybody's going to go.
Okay, let me start by asking how many have gone through Iowa Water training? I think there's quite a few of you, which is really good. And I think what we'll do is break you up into groups so there's at least one Iowa Water trained person in each group who's pretty familiar with the testing equipment. What I'm going to talk about is what happens when you get to a site. What we're going to do is divide you into 11 different groups, and ideally we want 2 to 4 people in each group. There will be coolers over here that have ice packs in them. Just grab one of the coolers because you'll want to put your water samples in the coolers until you bring them back. When you get to a site, what you want to do is pull out the appropriate field sheet, and we're going to make some observations at each site. Site number, there will be a site number assigned to each group for each particular site, and the site name. So just be very careful when you collect the sample not to overfill it or to spill it. So if you decide to use the sampling device, just try to make sure that the rope or the container does not touch the ground. Keep everything up off the ground. With this, we want you to sample on the upstream side of the bridge if possible. It's a matter of just lowering it down over the bridge. You have to sort of bounce it a little bit off the top of the water to get some water to flow in. Pull it up, rinse it 3 times, and then you can go ahead and collect your sample to fill these 2 bottles. Okay, so these are the 2 bottles that will fill in the field, and then go ahead and place both of these in the cooler and just keep them chilled until you get back here.
Somebody got group 1 bag? Somebody have a bag without a number?
We need a group 8 bag.
Lisa, do you want somebody to go with you that's Iowa Water trained? Okay. I'm here by myself, so well, I gathered that.
Don't take off yet until we get all this finalized, okay?
Angie, we get lost. It's your fault.
You got chemicals?
Is there?
You haven't gone to school? Yeah? What's your favorite part?
Melrose, just go down to Melrose. Just go straight down Melrose. There's a big sign saying turn.
Anybody who has a group member have more than one testing kit bag?
The bridge and put all that up there.
Well, let's see.
I'm not gonna throw the little bottles down.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, I can get up there and come back down and grab those from you. Well, that might have been the way I should have gone. I thought going through the left piece might be easier. You okay? What do we have next?
We have dissolved oxygen.
We just did that one.
No, dissolved oxygen is this one here. Ooh, the one with the neat little clip things.
There's the edge. Yep. Yeah. And this one I think you have to sit here for a couple minutes. Let's see. That's our instrument.
It's a little bit like that one. Try to look for more raccoon prints. So we can find them.
Here, Ben, you want to take a look at this one? Is it clear? You see the thing at the bottom? Yeah. All right.
And sell it.
So is that a 60?
Yeah. Do you want to see that? See how clear that one is?
Well, I can see it from here, but
Well, you're only looking through that
you
much
have to
water,
look
though.
through the
Yep,
water.
look through the top.
Clear as clear can be.
Yes, it is.
Well, almost, I guess.
And I'm going to ask you to tell us your name?
Ben
Oh, Ben, you have a last name, Ben?
Summers.
You want to hold that? What did you do today? You're going off camera, Ben. You have to stay in one place. Okay. Okay. Tell us what you did today.
Test water.
Right. You went with your mother and Stephanie and you helped test the water, and we have some pictures of you showing that. You know how many test sites we went to?
3.
That's right. What grade are you in?
First grade.
First grade. So you'll have something special to tell your classmates. Right. Anything else to say?
No.
Oh, well, it was nice having you on here. Thank you, Ben.
My name's Dave Ratliff. I run a business in Iowa City, Katy Engineering, but that really doesn't have anything to do with this project. I joined the Iowa Water Program in 1999 and haven't had an interest in water ever since. I received my Level 2 training in 2001. One of my test sites, 2 of my test sites are on Old Man's Creek. There have been some readings over the years that the USGS and the hygienics lab collect, and they were all of always real interest to me. And I always wondered why somebody did not go in and get more detail on why that was happening. Their tests are all taken from one place in Old Man's Creek, which is just about 6 miles up the stream. So one thing led to another, and that functionality is called to do a snapshot. So July 1st of this year, not even 90 days ago, we started the process of setting up this snapshot. And it grew from being about 7 or 8 test sites to being a grand total now of 66 individual test sites. We tailored this test a little different than a lot of them because we tied discharge in with our chemical and physical tests. All of the parameters that are given whenever you talk about water are always related to how much water is flowing. So we wanted that to be one of our measurements. I was really tickled pink when I got a lot of kids to volunteer to come in and learn how to do discharge. Last week we had a big class. The kids got in there. We taught them how to do discharge. And we got repeatability within 0.8%, which is fantastic. They came in today. They brought along a few of their friends, and we were able to man 4 individual teams to go out there and do the discharge. So this is all done by kids in that particular case. The adults and a lot of the other kids have gone out and done the chemical assessments after they were taught by Lynette with Iowa Water on how to do them. The U.S. Geological Survey Office sent in 2 people as volunteers. They are doing discharge right behind us. And if we get comparable answers with them, that will give this credibility, this particular test credibility. In the long term, we have been running and will continue to run until the end of the month what we call a biological monitor, where crews are going in at every bridge and sampling the macroinvertebrates, the little bugs that swim around in the water. Okay? And we've already received a lot of that data, and it's being correlated. And we're expecting to have this report in written format in 6 to 8 weeks. It will be available on the web, and anybody will be able to see it. How's that?
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
We all live in a watershed. Everything we do affects the soil, water, air, plants, and animals. I am reminded of the words of Chief Seattle, who said, "Man did not weave the web of life, he is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself."